Hello, and welcome back to another video of getting familiar with Photoshop. I'm Svenja from Svenja Christina Photography, and I love editing. Specifically, I love creating dreamy, magical images that blur the line between reality and dream. And I use Photoshop to create these kinds of magical images. Now, I'm going to show you how to use this big and intimidating program too, so that you can use it with confidence. If you missed last week's video, I'll make sure to link it up here and in the description box below. Today's video is going to be a little bit longer because I want to give you all of the good stuff. Today we're going to talk about adjustment layers. I would encourage you to grab your coffee or other caffeinated beverage of choice. Let's get started. I want to direct your attention to the adjustment layers up here. Adjustment layers are a special kind of layer that is used for modifying color or contrast. And the advantage of using those kinds of layers for corrections as opposed to applying them directly to your image is that you edit in a non-destructive way. So let's dive into some of them. We're going to click on the first one that looks like a sun. This one is a brightness contrast layer. And that is the menu for the brightness contrast adjustment layer. If you drag this slider down towards the left, everything in the image is getting darker. All the values are affected in the exact same way. If you drag it up towards the right, everything is getting brighter. Every single pixel is affected in the same way and pushed towards being more bright. This layer also has an option to correct for contrast. If you drag it towards the left, the image becomes duller because contrast is decreased. If you drag it to the right, the contrast gets stronger. So contrast just means that the darks are getting darker and the brights are getting brighter, so that edges stand out more clearly. Setting it back to 0. This is all that the brightness contrast layer does. I'm going to show you a different layer that does something very similar. I'm going to just toggle it off. The next adjustment layer I want to check out with you is the one that looks like a battery with the plus and the minus sign. This is called an exposure adjustment layer. So we're going to click it, and as you can see here comes up the exposure adjustment menu, and it has 3 sliders: exposure, offset, and gamma correction. Now you might wonder, what the heck are those? Because they're so strangely named. The exposure slider is basically the same thing as brightness contrast, but while it affects the full tonal range of an image, so the full tonal range means it goes from the very dark parts to the very bright parts. And I'm dragging this super slowly because this slider is very sensitive. And as you can see, I'm not even fully there, and it turned pitch black. Now let's turn this back. 0 was my midpoint, or my neutral point, and I turn it right and it's getting brighter. Look what it does to my highlights, like they're blown out and we're not even close to being anywhere. So it affects the full tonal range. However, the exposure slider itself targets the lighter tones more when an image is brightened or darkened. Whereas brightness and contrast, the one we previously explored, it targets all tones equally. Now, exposure targets the light tones. Offset targets the dark tones. Like, it still affects everything, however, the dark tones are a bit more affected when you use the sliders. So pay attention to my trees and the bird. If we take this slider and turn it left, you see it turns dark very, very quickly. So it's another one of those that is really sensitive. And you can always hover over top of this and drag from here. That is making adjustments in much smaller steps than here, so you can fine tune it better. See here, the brights are not as affected, but the darks are. Now we're taking it back to 0. This is where its neutral state is, and we're turning it up. And my dark tones look pretty washed out. There. Now you know, offset targets are darks. So gamma, there's only one tonal range left, targets the midtones. And as you can see, it's not in a neutral space at 0 like the other ones, it's at 1. So if you are like me and you expect that when you take this slider and you move it towards the right, the image gets brighter, you're in for a surprise. See what happens when I take it right. It gets darker. So this is really counterintuitive, but you will see that there's a pattern here as well. Pitch black down here. And it's one of those, again, where it's very sensitive. And here we're going brighter, especially on the midtones. This is just to show you what that slider does. I know I have to be careful that I press 1.00 on my keyboard, otherwise it will not reset. I hardly ever use this adjustment layer, but I wanted to mention it to be complete. I prefer using brightness contrast. So moving on to other layers that also target exposure, but in a more specific way. Exposure and brightness contrast affect all the pixels at the same time, but with the levels layer and the curves layer, the two we are going to look at next, you can specifically target midtones, highlights, and shadows separately. So it's much more specific. Now let's check this one out. This is the levels layer, the one that looks like little mountains. It comes up in the levels menu right here. Look at the black triangle on the left. It adjusts the shadows. If I drag it in, the shadows get darker and it affects only the shadows. Look at the lighter tones over here. They're still bright. Now have a look at the white triangle on the right. It adjusts the highlights. If I move it in, the highlights get brighter. The shadows and midtones are relatively unaffected. Depending on how far I go, obviously. The gray triangle is for my midtones. And you would expect that if you drag towards the highlights, it would get brighter, right? But no, it gets darker. So this is why levels is a little bit backwards. When the number gets bigger, like down here, it becomes brighter, the midtones. And when the number becomes smaller, the midtones get darker. I'm resetting it to 100. Here's another little black triangle. If I want to lift my shadows, make them brighter, I take this little black triangle and slide it in. It makes the shadows brighter and duller and creates a matte effect. If I use this white triangle here and I drag it in, it darkens the brights. So say I had this image adjusted for some contrast. I just drag the bright slider in towards where the whites begin and the dark triangle to where the darks begin, and I toggle it on and off. You can already see it looks more contrasty. Now say I was worried about these tones right here. Say I pushed my highlights a little more. See how it starts to look blown out here? And say I did that to my darks as well. See how you start to lose detail up here. And say I like the punch that this provides, but I don't want to have it as strong. I could try to balance it out with the output sliders down below, drag the highlight slider in, and it doesn't really save the highlights, it just adds a grayish tone to them, so it doesn't look pure white. And with the shadows, it kind of recovers some detail, but it becomes hazy. So unless you're going specifically for that style, I would recommend not to use that to such an extent and to be more mindful where you put the little triangles up here. Now, this is in the RGB mode. It also has channels listed here. This is the red channel, and here you can affect reds and cyans. Again, here, if you drag that in, that darkens the cyans, and this here affects the cyans and the highlights. And here, the highlights for the reds and the dark tones on the red channel. And we have the same thing for green and magenta. If we drag it left, we get green. We drag it right, we get magenta for the midtones. And if we drag it in here, this is my highlight slider for green, my darks slider for green, my dark slider for magenta, my highlight slider for magenta. And we have one more to go, the blue channel. This is blue and yellow. If I drag it left, we get blue in the midtones. If I drag it right, we get yellow in the midtones. Now for my highlights, if I drag it in, this is blue in the highlights. This is blue in the shadows. This is yellow in the shadows. And this is yellow in the highlights. So you just have to play with it if you are confused. I just wanted to show you quickly what this all does. And we're back at RGB, and here I have some contrast going on. So I'm gonna just toggle that one off. Now I'm gonna show you one more way to add an adjustment layer. We're gonna go into layer, and then we're gonna scroll into new adjustment layer, and we're gonna go click curves, and we're gonna click OK. So I'm gonna take my little arrow tool and bring this up so I can see it fully. I'm gonna try and take it out of here. Perfect, because I want to show you what it does first. I'm just gonna drag it and make it big. Let me just put that here. With curves, you can do a lot of things. You can brighten up an image just by clicking here and brightening it. And see, it affects the entire image. And you can darken it by dragging the point on the curve down. And as you can see, it affects basically every single pixel in this image. I'm gonna reset it by clicking this button here. It also shows the histogram, which we are already familiar with. So this area here, as you can also see, this is really bright, this is really dark. So these areas here are my bright areas, and these here are the dark areas of my image. So if I want to add some contrast, meaning I want to have the bright areas brighter and the dark areas darker, I'm going to click here on the curve for my bright areas, and I'm going to push them up because pushing it up makes it brighter. And I'm going to make the darks darker. So I'm going to click here in my dark area, and I'm going to drag it down. This gives you the typical classical S curve, and that adds contrast to your image. So this is how curves work. I'm going to reset that again. Say you want to brighten something without it affecting every other area of your image. Say you wanted to brighten the darks. You're gonna make a little dot right here in the center, and you want to make sure that that input and output are the same so that it's on that line. And then you're gonna click here on your darks, and you're gonna lift them up to brighten them. And now it's only the darks that are affected, not the brights. Say you only wanted to brighten the brights without it affecting the darker areas of your image. You're gonna click up here into the bright areas, and you're gonna drag it up. My bright areas here and here, they just got brighter. If you just wanted to have your brights darker, you click in your bright area at the top, and you're gonna drag that point down. See how they become really weird and gray? No, we don't want that. But if you wanted to just have your darks darker, you're gonna click on the dark area, and you're just gonna drag it down. It's pretty simple, but it might take some getting used to. And yes, it has a histogram just like our levels did. I'm just gonna bring that back in here. There, it's back. And if we looked at levels and click into levels, levels also has this histogram. So it's pretty neat. You know your bright areas. You don't have that many bright areas because it's kind of flat here, but you have a lot of dark areas or a lot of dark tones because those are peaking. Let's dive deeper into curves. What you see here is a diagonal line. This is a linear curves adjustment layer. Basically, this is neutral. It doesn't do anything right now, at least on normal blend mode. Now, if you take that little corner right here, you take it down, look what happens to the white areas in my image. They get darker. So this is very similar to our levels layer, to the slider down here. Now, back in my curves layer, if I take this little white triangle and I move it towards the left, if I drag it in, see what happens to my bright areas? They become brighter. Now this is very similar in my levels layer to the slider right here. I drag it in, I get that blown out effect. Back to curves. I just wanted to show you how similar they are. I'm gonna take that and drag it back up. Now we're gonna explore the darks. They're down here. If I'm taking this little square and I move it up, see what happens to the dark areas of my image? They become brighter. You get that matte effect again. And this is similar in levels to that slider down here. See, it's the same effect, it's just a different layout. If in curves, I'm taking that black triangle and I move that in, it darkens my blacks. So it's the opposite thing, right? If I go into my levels layer, this would be that little icon right here, doing the same thing. That's the beauty in Photoshop. You can get the same results using different tools. So you can choose levels, or you can choose curves, whichever you find more logical. And similarly to the levels layer, the curves layer also has the red, green, and blue option for channels. It looks different. If we drag this up, we're in the reds. If we drag this down, we're in the cyans. You just need to remember all of this here is reds. All of this here is the cyans. Now we also have this for green and magenta. If you drag it up, all the stuff up here is green and all the stuff down here is magenta. So basically it's like you slice this into 2 triangles. The top triangle is green, the lower triangle is magenta. And we have the last channel that is again blue and yellow. You drag it up, you're in the blues. You drag it down, you're in the yellows. I know, super overwhelming. Don't fret about it, but I wanted to mention it so you know what this little adjustment layer is capable of. And that one here too. Now, another really beautiful thing about curves that I want to show you is this little hand icon with the 2 arrows. Say I want to target a very specific part of an image. Say I wanted to brighten the goose's feathers. I'm clicking into this hand tool with the sliders, and then I'm taking my mouse and I'm setting it right here where it's dark and I want to brighten it. And then I'm going to drag it up. That brightens it. It doesn't only brighten my goose's wing, it also brightened all the tones of the same value here. So you see my darks, my trees, they became a lot brighter too. Say I didn't want that. This is where my layer masks come in handy. When the layer mask is white, that means you can see the effect. If my layer mask was black, and I'm just going to press Command I on my keyboard, now it's black. See what happened here? It inverted the effect. It hid it. Black hides, Command I, white makes visible. Now, if I didn't want my trees to be bright, I could just press B for the brush tool, and then just to make sure that I actually have black and white and not some weird shade of black and white, I'm going to press D. This resets my brush tool. And now I have white here. And if I start to paint in here with white, nothing's going to happen because white on white, it's white. I want to make sure my brush tool is black. So I can just press X on my keyboard, or say I didn't remember that shortcut, I can use this little switchy tool here. This is the little corner with 2 arrows. If I click that, it just switches back from black and white back and forth. Now I want to make sure it's black, and with my black brush, making sure I'm in this layer mask for my curves layer, and I'm going to make my brush a bit bigger by pressing the right bracket tool. Brush is at 100% opacity, 100% flow, so that is a solid color. I'm just going to start painting on here. See how it's getting darker here on my tree line. And just paint all the way there. Now my trees are darker, and see what happened here in my curves layer? Everything that is black is hidden. Everything that is white shows. So the effect, if I toggle it off, now the layer is not visible. It's that grayed out square. This is what we had before. Now I toggled it on, the eye is visible, and it's only affecting the goose. Now I did a really crappy job here. As you can see, my layer mask, I'm pressing the Option key and clicking in my mask. That's not really, I was slopping. That's not really a good shape of the goose. And to get rid of my crappy selection, I'm just going to press Command Delete, and my layer mask is white again. Now we can move on and make a good selection by choosing one of the tools on this side. And we'll discuss that in our video next week. This is a really important video. Masking is an art, and the more time you spend on perfecting your mask, the more realistic your images will look. I know it's tedious work, but it'll pay off, I promise. Now that was a little sneak peek about what's in store next week. If you found today's video on adjustment layers helpful, please give me a thumbs up, and it would be an honor to have you subscribe to my brand new channel and to have you as part of my community here on YouTube. If you have any editing related questions or requests of what you would like me to edit next, please leave them in the comments below. I look forward to reading them. And next week we're going to be talking about, as promised, about making selections. So I'll see you then. Stay tuned. Bye bye. Am I in focus? I think I am. I hope I am. No. I need more coffee because apparently this isn't working.